Welcome, and let your mind drift to a time long past where whispers held more power than shouts.
Imagine yourself as a Roman matron, gracefully adorned in white linen, your footsteps barely audible on the polished marble as you are guided through the palace corridor. You are raised with the deep conviction that silence embodies strength, that dignity is found in obedience, and that your secret roles as daughter, wife, and mother were safeguarded by virtue. Yet tonight, you are not present as a wife, nor as a noblewoman. You are here because your husband, your beloved, proud, and trembling husband, delivered you as a tribute. At the corridor's end, a door softly yields. Incense burns, thick and sweet, but its fragrance cannot conceal the sharp tang of sweat and fear. You do not cry out. You have been too well-schooled for such an outburst. You know you will survive this night, not through defiance, but through the profound act of forgetting. You tell yourself with a desperate plea that this will be the final time, but deep down you know it never truly is.
History often celebrates emperors, recounting tales of wars, laws, and victories etched in stone. Yet, for every Caesar crowned in glory, countless thousands remain unnamed in the annals of time. Their anonymity is not due to inaction, but because the atrocities committed against them were too profound to be spoken aloud. This narrative, then, is not of those who ruled, but of those who quietly endured. Within the court of Caligula, silence was never a void. It was a meticulously engineered weapon. Beneath the veneer of every opulent or grotesque ritual lay a system not merely of raw power, but of insidious psychological manipulation. Caligula had no need for vast armies to enforce loyalty. He required only the corrosive power of shame. To subjugate a woman, he exploited her body, and to control a man, he targeted the bodies of those he cherished. When the screams finally ceased, he understood his victory was complete. The survivors of Caligula's palace, scarred and silenced, could not recount their stories, for they were never truly meant to be heard.
She was known as Julia, a name that was soon brutally stripped away. Divested of her title and her very garments, she was transformed into a mere guest of the emperor. Her father, a senator once renowned for his unyielding pride, had promised her hand to a distinguished general. Instead, he delivered her to Caligula's private chamber, a chilling exchange for the preservation of his own lands. She neither cried nor screamed, for her resistance manifested not in defiance, but in a profound fracturing of her spirit. She swiftly learned to sever her soul from her physical form, smiling when obligated and speaking when required, while within she meticulously sealed every inner door. Julia survived long after Caligula met his end, yet she never again embraced her husband, never gazed into a mirror, and never uttered her daughter's name aloud. She nurtured her child with a deep and abiding love, but always without the comfort of her voice, for the emperor had irrevocably taught her that words could be wielded as weapons, and silence, conversely, could be the ultimate act of survival. Upon Claudius's ascension, the empire meticulously cleansed itself in gleaming marble. Walls were scrubbed, rooms repurposed, and floors polished to a brilliant sheen, with historians meticulously instructed to chronicle only this restoration, never the preceding decay. Yet trauma, unlike blood, cannot be simply scrubbed from stone. It lingers, echoing through the years. Those who lived through such horrors carried their experiences in their very gait, in their subtle gestures, and in their profound refusal to speak of certain harrowing years. We label them survivors, yet they were also unwitting oracles, bearing witness to a world where dignity was reduced to a mere currency, and obedience became a twisted form of absolution. Consider Marcus, a boy of 12, his first beard not yet appearing, when his uncle, a governor desperate to reclaim imperial favor, brought him to the palace. He grasped little of what was expected, understanding only that he could not return home until the emperor smiled. The precise moment of his ordeal eluded his memory, leaving only the indelible aftermath, a world spinning, countless eyes observing, and the pervasive scent of oil, breath, and profound shame.
Marcus matured into a man who never chose to marry. Though he engaged in relationships with noblemen, soldiers, and poets, he never once spoke of love. When questioned about this, he would simply shrug, once remarking, "What would I do with love? It requires trust." History often purports that Caligula's reign of terror concluded with his assassination. Yet his victims were never truly freed. They were simply cruelly forgotten. Rome continued its march forward. Wars resumed, and grand statues were carved. But within the hushed drawing-rooms and private bedchambers, behind the closed doors of seaside villas, a profound silence reigned. The wives who had been forced to perform for the emperor ceased attending public festivals. The daughters selected for training never returned to their music, and the boys, once promised honor, opted for exile rather than marriage. An entire generation became masters of pretense, and the world, in its ignorance, praised their grace. For these silent sufferers there were no grand monuments. No lines were ever etched in marble for the senator's wife, who chose to end her own life after the third imperial summons. Nor were there inscriptions for the twins, once declared gifts to the gods, who returned days later, unable to speak, eat, or rest without a constant flinch. Rome, in its grand narrative, only chronicles glory. Yet beneath the very stones of the Forum, within the hidden palatial drains, and in the fleeting, averted glances of nobles who once stood proud, the true, unspoken record endures. The trauma inflicted by tyranny rarely announces itself with a roar. Instead, it returns in quieter, insidious ways. In a dinner gathering, when no one dares utter the emperor's name. In a marriage bed that remains cold for decades. Or in a son who, despite his inner turmoil, must bow to a father he cannot meet in the eye. This, indeed, was Caligula's most profound and chilling achievement. Not grand spectacle, but pervasive, suffocating silence.
Valeria spoke but once, and then, inexplicably, never again. She was merely 15, perhaps young for marriage, yet old enough to capture unwanted attention. Her family, like countless others, feigned ignorance of the true nature of the imperial invitation, a scroll that deceptively promised a private meal to discuss her father's political future. No genuine discussion ever took place. What transpired within that chamber was never uttered aloud. not even when she returned home, pale and bleeding, escorted by a guard whose smile was unsettlingly wide. Her father openly wept. Her mother collapsed in despair, but Valermia herself stood utterly still. From that harrowing day forward, she steadfastly refused to speak, not from madness, but from a profound act of reclaiming control. She would deny Rome another single word. She lived to old age, unmarried, in a serene countryside home, surrounded by rescued animals and fragrant dried herbs, her name forever absent from official records. Yet through her profound silence, she subtly instructed her nieces how to convey no with their eyes, and how to discern the insidious presence of danger within a man's laughter.
Rome's esteemed historians were far from foolish. They were acutely aware of the atrocities that had unfolded during those dark years, with some even bearing direct witness. Yet parchment scrolls were costly, and the unvarnished truth proved exceedingly dangerous. There remained a fragile concept of honor to be safeguarded, if not for the empire itself, then certainly for its countless victims. Consequently, they resorted to writing in intricate code, speaking vaguely of moral decay, madness, and unnatural appetites, but conspicuously naming no names. For to name a victim, they believed, was to inadvertently trap her story, to bind her once more to the hand that had inflicted her pain. Thus, in a twisted act of liberation, they erased her from the official record, hoping to set her free. However, such erasure, they soon discovered, always exacts a profound and lasting cost.
Crispus, the son of a soldier, was a young man of remarkable strength, cleverness, and capability. At the tender age of 16, he was selected to join the prestigious palace guard, an immense honor for his family. He stood sentinel at various doors, witnessing far more than his young mind could truly comprehend. One fateful night, however, he observed his younger brother being led through a heavy velvet curtain. Instinctively, Crispus stepped forward, protesting, "He's too young." A formidable Praetorian guard forcibly pushed him back, issuing a chilling warning, "You'll be next if you say another word." So Crispus stood, frozen, and watched. When the agonizing screams began, he forcibly averted his gaze to the floor, uttering nothing. Years later, long after Caligula's downfall, Crispus returned to that very chamber, wielding an axe to its door and setting the tapestries within ablaze. Yet the lingering, haunting smell of that night never truly left him. Not ever.
Silence, when meticulously practiced over time, transforms into a profound language of its own, and the survivors of Caligula's reign developed it with chilling precision. It manifested in a mother who instinctively held her daughter's hand a little too tightly in public, in a senator who thereafter never sat with his back to any door, and in a concubine who demanded perpetual darkness at every hour. This subtle language of survival, though unspoken, endured. For what truly is trauma, if not memory systematically denied its voice? Rome possessed no concept of therapy, no word for recovery. Instead, it offered rituals, purification, exile, and marriage, none of which truly healed the deep wounds.
Thus people became their own living tombs, locking their pain deep within. They married out of obligation, bore children out of duty, and endlessly recounted tales of triumph, yet never acknowledging the immense cost. And this, precisely this, was the manner in which the empire continued its relentless march forward, not through genuine healing, but through silence, artfully disguised as strength.
There was a woman named Livia, a humble servant, never high-born or titled, yet she had attended to numerous noble families and intimately understood the silent suffering they endured. After Caligula's demise, she began to gather these women, quietly, under the cloak of night, in hushed kitchens and secluded courtyards, sharing bitter wine and cracked bread. They never explicitly called it a meeting, nor did they utter a single word about the horrors they had faced. Yet simply in their shared presence, something profound shifted. Livia gently taught them how to reclaim eye contact, how to navigate the bustling market without trembling, and how to articulate no without lowering their voices. In a world that had reduced them to mere instruments, Livia meticulously restored a precious fragment of their true selves. She died unrecorded by any official history, yet dozens of Roman women secretly carved her distinctive sigil, 3 dots arranged in a triangle under the undersides of their chromes, a silent testament to a secret sisterhood, a living form of memory.
Beyond any singular atrocity, Caligula's most insidious legacy was a profound generational disfigurement, not of bodies, but of the very fabric of belief. He had systematically indoctrinated an entire civilization with the insidious notion that dignity was conditional, that love was a debilitating weakness, and that pleasure could be brutally extracted from others without any consequence. Even after his violent death, this corrosive ideology stubbornly lingered. Young boys, raised by fathers shattered by their experiences, matured into men who tragically mistook cruelty for genuine power. Girls, nurtured by mothers silenced by trauma, learned to instinctively flinch at acts of kindness, as if such gestures might invariably precede a harsh command. Empires ultimately fall, yet lessons, particularly those deeply etched into the human spirit, stubbornly persist. By the time Nero ascended to power, the palace had been meticulously scrubbed clean. The marble gleamed, the scent of blood replaced by exotic imported oils from the East. Servants retrained and guards rotated. Yet the trauma remained, not within the physical walls, but within the very people who moved through them, in the women who never dared to laugh too loudly, in the senators who perpetually avoided eye contact with imperial messengers, and in the children taught never to inquire when their mothers mysteriously vanished for a night.
Aulus was a boy born into a world after Caligula's death. Never having seen the emperor or heard his voice, yet he intimately witnessed the profound impact upon his mother. She was unfailingly polite, always polite, and yet profoundly cold. She meticulously taught Aulus proper speech, how to bow and how to stand with unwavering posture, but she never offered a hug, never gently touched his face. On one occasion, when he sought comfort by attempting to crawl into her bed during a thunderstorm, she shrieked with such intensity that the neighbors rushed to their aid. Aulus matured, feeling perpetually confused, then angry, and eventually bitter. When he joined the Senate, he carried himself with the refined poise of a man who had absorbed silence from birth, yet internally he felt a profound emptiness. His mother never disclosed the reason for her emotional distance, but he, in his heart, always knew. Generational trauma indeed requires no explicit naming to be transmitted. It moves subtly through ingrained habits, through deliberate avoidance, and through inherited shame, teaching children that their very bodies are not their own, that fear is a normal state of being, and that love is tragically conditional upon obedience.
Rome, in its imperial grandeur, became a masterclass in this insidious form of collective forgetting. When an individual vanished, one simply did not inquire. When someone married a stranger twice their age, polite smiles were offered. And when a woman walked with downcast eyes, she was lauded as modest. The empire proudly labeled this civilization, yet beneath the surface it was a systematic adaptation to profound collective trauma. Not all, however, succumbed to silent suffering. A courageous few rebelled, not with swords, but with the potent weapon of memory. They emerged as poets, playwrights, and midwives, crafting stories in the guise of fables and weaving pain into poignant parables, finding ingenious ways to speak without explicitly naming. One particular play, performed in a shadowy corner of the bustling Subura, featured a tyrannical king who compelled his guests to dine in silence, while chilling screams resonated from behind a curtain. The audience nervously chuckled, some openly wept, and a mere week later the courageous playwright disappeared. Yet the play itself endured, for stories, once truly heard, possess an unyielding power that cannot be erased.
The pervasive trauma did not confine itself to Rome. As the empire expanded its vast dominion, so too did its insidious culture of silence. Provinces across the vast realm were systematically taught the same chilling lessons: unwavering obedience, absolute secrecy, and the severe price of daring to speak out. In far-off Egypt, a noblewoman named Khepri meticulously penned a letter in broken Latin to her sister, conveying the heartbreaking message, "The priest has taken our daughter for the 3rd time. He says it is for the emperor's blessing. I want to drown myself, but she needs me to stand." Centuries later, that poignant letter was unearthed, buried beneath a wall in Alexandria, never delivered, merely folded, hidden, and protected from judging eyes. What transpires when silence itself is elevated to a sacred status? Rome began to ritualize its collective forgetting, orchestrating festivals where victims were compelled to smile and ceremonies designed to laud emperors who left only ruins in their destructive wake. The public theater of survival evolved into a new, grotesque performance, one where profound trauma was artfully masked by superficial celebration. Women danced, children sang, men cheered, yet beneath it all, no one truly felt safe.
Sabina was born into a life of privilege and wealth. Her father had served under Caligula, and her mother had miraculously survived his reign, yet no one within their household ever dared to speak of that harrowing period. Sabina, inherently curious, once innocently inquired of her grandmother why their grand house possessed a peculiar door that opened only to a bricked wall. The elderly woman gazed at her for a long, silent moment before softly replying, "Some rooms were built to keep sound in." Sabina, sensing the unspoken depth, never asked again. Instead she wrote endlessly, filling pages in intricate code, crafting profound metaphors, and even employing invisible ink. She became a historian, though one whose invaluable books were destined never to be published.
Centuries later, a hidden journal was discovered within a cave, its fragile pages filled with intricate allegories of birds confined in golden cages and gardens that miraculously bloomed only after devastating fires. Her name remained unknown to history, yet her powerful, enduring voice miraculously survived.
A pervasive myth suggests that silence offers protection, yet Rome unequivocally demonstrated that silence also profoundly isolates. Survivors of that dark era were not merely forgotten by the sweeping currents of history, they were tragically forgotten by their very selves. Severed from the language of their pain, they drifted, their suffering untold, their agony normalized. Consider a senator who had witnessed his wife brutally taken by Caligula. He never remarried, not from overwhelming grief, but from a deep-seated conviction that he had fundamentally failed as a man, believing that honor, once shattered, could never be restored. He dutifully mentored others and served the empire with unwavering loyalty, yet he never uttered her name again. Upon his death, his will contained a chillingly concise instruction: let the family name end here. And so it profoundly did. Yet not all endings are destined to be silent.
In the distant provinces, hushed whispers gradually blossomed into defiant stories. A courageous woman in Gaul meticulously crafted a secret altar where abused women could leave their heartfelt letters to the gods. In Hispania, a young boy began teaching orphans songs that subtly spoke of emperors who, despite their power, could be wounded. Meanwhile, a painter in Antioch created murals where every depicted face pointedly averted its gaze from the imperial throne. Each of these acts was small, intensely private, and undeniably dangerous, yet collectively they seeded something profoundly new. Not a violent revolution, but a living, breathing memory. The mighty empire had eventually crumbled, not in a sudden cataclysm of fire and blood, but through a quiet, insidious erosion, a faint crack appearing in a marble stair, a governor's moment of hesitation, a priest's quiet refusal to kneel. The true decay began not in the bustling streets, but deep within the weary souls of those who had endured far too much for far too long. They continued to wear their togas, recited the ancient rites, and toasted the gods, that the fundamental conviction had irrevocably vanished. And when belief truly dies, no army, however vast, can offer salvation.
Cloelia, a humble baker's daughter, harbored no interest in grand rebellion, having witnessed firsthand its brutal costs. Her aunt's tongue cruelly severed, her cousin married off to a man twice her age to settle a governor's debt. Yet Cloelia possessed a powerful memory, not solely her own, but that inherited from her mother. A mother who would tremble whenever palace banners passed, who meticulously kept Cloelia far from soldiers, and who instinctively flinched at laughter that sounded too confident. Cloelia inherited this pervasive silence, but she resolutely refused to obey it. She began, quietly, to teach young girls how to read. Not scripture or law, but personal letters, intimate diaries, and profound truth meticulously carved into the very margins of Roman womanhood. She referred to these as texts no one wrote, while her grateful pupils affectionately called them reminders that we are not alone. For centuries, survivors had been instructed to seek healing through the act of forgetting. But forgetting, as Cloelia knew, is never true healing. Genuine healing demands truth, and truth, undeniably, is dangerous. This precisely is why Caligula and others like him
ruthlessly targeted memory, aiming to eradicate not just the act, but the fundamental ability to declare, "This happened to me, and I am still here."
Aulus, now an old man, sat before his eager grandchildren. They yearned for grand tales of gods, epic battles, and glorious triumphs. But instead, he spoke to them of silence. He recounted how it suffocates, how it insidiously spreads, and, most importantly, how it can ultimately be broken. "We are not responsible for what was done to us," he gently explained, "but we are profoundly responsible for what we allow to continue." It was the very first time he had ever uttered a word about his mother. He wept quietly, and in that profound, tender moment, his long-held silence finally, irrevocably ended.
Rome bestowed upon the world its laws, its intricate roads, its durable concrete, and its magnificent aqueducts. Yet it also subtly imparted a more sinister lesson: how to weaponize shame, how to conceal cruelty within elaborate rituals, how to supplant true justice with mere spectacle, and how to tragically transmute profound trauma into an enduring heritage. What Caligula inflicted upon Rome's physical bodies was unspeakable, but what he did to its very voice was far more devastating. He cunningly made silence feel like an undeniable safety. This chilling lesson has been learned all too well by countless empires throughout history. You witness its insidious echoes in modern courtrooms, where victims are questioned about their attire, their demeanor, and their perceived delays. You observe it within families, where deeply buried secrets lie hidden beneath cherished heirlooms and polite, practiced smiles. You see it manifest in governments, where uncomfortable truths are archived, redacted, and outright denied. Caligula may be long dead, but the very mechanisms that enabled his tyranny persist. So, what then is our imperative? We must remember, not with grand monuments or vengeful acts, but through the profound power of naming, through the empathetic act of listening, and through the courage of uttering that which was never meant to be said. A young girl today who steadfastly refuses to be silenced is not merely brave, she is in fact historic. She walks in the profound shadow of every woman who could not speak, every man who bowed his head in shame, and every child tragically told their body was not their own. And when she bravely raises her voice, she becomes the living, breathing proof that silence can indeed end, that empires may crumble, but people, when they survive together, possess the indomitable spirit to rise. Therefore, if you carry nothing else from this narrative, remember this fundamental truth: silence is not an absence. It is a deliberate design, and the act of breaking it is a profound defiance older than the very foundations of Rome itself.
Now let the echoes of these ancient stories gently fade away, and may your dreams be filled with peace and quiet strength.